In the previous section, we saw how to do gradients using the HTML5 canvas, but if all you want is a gradient, it's actually easier to do with CSS. So in this video, I'll show you how to set up gradients in CSS, and we'll also look at the different types of shadows that we can create. So I'll start by getting rid of the code from the previous video. And then let's create a nice simple div, which will give an ID of gradient. And then we'll just select it in the usual way, and we'll start off by giving it a certain width and height. So we'll just have 300 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And we'll start off with a background color of blue, just to check that everything's looking good. There we go. In fact, let's make it 500 pixels. Great. So, if we want a gradient that goes, for example, from white to blue, top to bottom, we just use background and then linear gradient, and then we give our two colors. So white and blue. Simple as that. And then we get our beautiful gradient. And of course, we can put any sort of content on top of that as well. So that's just our background for a div. We can put whatever we like behind that. Note that I've left the background color is blue for browsers that don't support the gradient. So let's see what other options we can put in there. We can switch it to a left to right gradient by simply putting to right as our first parameter, and then it will become a left to right gradient. We can even make it a diagonal gradient by making it to bottom right. And you see my text editor is even clever enough to know what that is before we even run it in the browser. But now it's top left to bottom right. And of course, you can change these to anything you like. So if you want it to go the other way around, you could change that to top left. And then that will start with white at the bottom right and go up there. You can even have multiple colors in here. So if we wanted something that looked pretty horrendous, we could use white, red, green, and blue. And there it is. Whew, that's a bit special. We can also do radial gradients. So let's just create a new div. And this is exactly the same. So in fact, I'll just copy the width and the height down from up there. And then we just use background radial gradient. And then we might have white and blue again. We could of course use HTML color codes there as well as the color names. And then we get a gradient coming out from the middle. But there's a little challenge that's just appeared for you. So can you recreate this bottom gradient? And I'll tell you that it's green at this end and yellow at the other. Try and do it without looking at this code if possible. Go for it. All right. Hope you managed that. I'll just do it by creating an ID called challenge gradient. And then, whoops, don't forget to close it. We'll give it a width of 500 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And then the background is going to be a linear gradient because it's not radial here. And we want to go to the bottom left. So it's to bottom left. And we're going green to yellow. Simple as that. Refresh, and that's what the code was. So that's about it when it comes to gradients. Let's look at how we use CSS3 to apply shadows. There are two ways to apply shadows in CSS3, and that is with text and box shadows. So we'll start with some text. In fact, let's have an H2. This text will have a shadow. And then it's very simple. All we do is apply text shadow and then the offset to the right and the offset down. And that means that the shadow will be 2 pixels to the right and 2 pixels down of the original. Now that looks fairly horrendous as it is, but we could do a lot more with that. We can add a color. So let's use my favorite green. There we go. Still looks pretty horrendous, but we've got the shadow. At the moment though, you can see that the shadow is completely solid. It's essentially a copy of the original text. Generally, you're going to want a slightly blurred shadow. So let's try putting in a bit of a blur. This will give a 4 pixel blur. And there we go. You can see that looks a lot nicer than it did before. Still not necessarily beautiful with the black and green combo, but it looks a lot better than it did. We could even have invisible text. By setting the color to white and just showing the shadow. A slightly different sort of shadow effect can be achieved as a kind of a glow by essentially doing a shadow with a 0 offset. So we use 0 and 0 for the offset and then say 5 pixels red for the shadow, and then you get this sort of neon-y glow effect. You can even, if you really want to, put multiple shadows on a single element of text, and you can put them in different directions. So we might have a shadow which goes to the left and up with a blur of say 4 pixels and make it yellow. And there we go. So obviously I would never advise having that sort of a look in your websites, but you can do it if you want to. So remember to use text shadowing gracefully, and it can add a real nice subtle boost to the style of your page. More commonly used than text shadowing though is box shadowing. So this, as you might imagine, happens on divs or any kind of box-shaped element. So I'll call it shadow. Then let's bring it in. So we'll set the width to 200 pixels and the height to, and the box shadow initially to, let's say 3 pixels, 3 pixels. There we go. I should probably give a background color to the box as well. Let's use antique white. There we go. So it doesn't look great, once again, as a completely solid shadow, but if we choose the blur, so 3px, then it looks a lot nicer. And it really does have the effect of lifting the div off the page a little bit. Notice that that's quite dark immediately around the div, so you might want to change that to grey to have something a little bit more subtle. And if you want to really bring this off the page, then you just increase the box shadow to maybe 12 pixels. 12 pixels and then perhaps 6 pixels. And there you go. You've got a much bigger shadow there. And that's pretty much it. So you now know how to add shadows to divs, how to add shadows and glow effects to text, and how to create gradients. Obviously, none of the shadows or the gradients that we've created here look particularly great, but used subtly, you really can add a bit of zip to your web pages. So use it well. We're now going to move on to look at transformations in CSS3.